Hello everyone. In this video, I'm going to be breaking down Verity by Colleen Hoover using the 3-act structure. In particular, I'm going to be using the 8-sequence story structure. On this channel, we cover all things writing and screenwriting. If that's something that interests you, make sure to like and subscribe. And make sure you turn the notification bell on. That way you're hit up every time I post a new video. So first I want to recap the 8-sequence structure, and then we're going to jump right into the Verity breakdown. The 8-sequence structure is a structure that has been used in Hollywood and publishing going all the way back to the silent film era. You essentially divide the story into 8 successive chunks, and this makes the story more manageable, and it solves the issue of having an overwhelmingly large Act 2. So I'm going to put on screen how the story sequence structure should look. You'll see that each sequence has a major plot point towards the latter half of that sequence. And you can kind of think of this plot point as the climax for that particular sequence. For instance, in sequence number 4, the climax of sequence 4 would be the midpoint. If you want a more in-depth explanation of the 8-sequence story structure, I'll have that video posted in the description box below. Going forward, I think I'm going to do more breakdowns on thrillers, whether it be novels or movies, because the thriller genre happens to be my area of focus when it comes to writing. And of course, if I get any major requests or if there's special occasions like a very big movie or book releasing, I'll definitely do breakdowns for those as well. Before we get started with the breakdown, I want to remind everyone that Verity is a very dark book, so there's a lot of trigger warnings for all types of things such as child abuse, domestic violence, and pretty much anything that you could be triggered on, it's probably in Verity. That might be a slight exaggeration, but it's only very slight. There's a lot of stuff in here that you definitely don't want kids to see. Okay, quick summary of Verity. Basically, you have the main character. Her name is Lowen, and she is I would say kind of a mid-lister author, which is exactly what it sounds like. She's kind of not a superstar author, but kind of like right in that medium range. She's also not a person who hasn't started or published anything before. Lowen is going to essentially catch a break by being presented with the opportunity to finish novels written by Verity. Verity is a very well-established author. She's very well known. Her works are all around the world. We're going to have a lot of the tension of the story coming from whether or not Verity is actually in a coma and whether or not Lowen and Jeremy will hook up. Right away in sequence 1, we get the things that you really need. We get the skills. We see that Lowen is a great writer. We get the wound. We hear about her mother recently passing and leaving her with medical bills and no money to actually pay them. And it's really important to note that sequence 1s work very well when we can build some kind of pity towards the main character. In fact, having them have the worst day of their life or one of the worst days of their life in sequence 1 works really well. In this book, it opens up with Lowen actually witnessing someone being killed in a car accident, or I guess a pedestrian getting hit by a car. And it's very visceral, it's very detailed at how this scene is captured. So we immediately feel for Lowen having been a witness to something like this. This sequence 1 builds all the way to the climax of Jeremy actually offering Lowen the job of finishing Verity's novels. After Lowen gets the job offer and contemplates whether or not she's going to be accepting the job, she does eventually accept it, and we know that she needs the money. As a result, she moves into the home of Verity and Jeremy. She meets Crew, their young son, and she tries to get adjusted and settled in so she can begin her work. During this time period, she sees, or she thinks she gets clues that Verity might not actually be in a coma. She might be faking it. And these are kind of strong clues. So this leads us to the question of Act 2 that's going to be driving the tension of the story, and it's whether or not Verity is actually awake, and the internal question of what's going to happen with her and Jeremy. Rather, will her and Jeremy actually begin a relationship? So now that we have 2 yes or no questions, we would like to see the answer to those questions at or before the end of Act 2. One thing that's a really big part of this story is that Verity has kind of a secret manuscript that she's hidden. Lowen finds it in the office, in Verity's office, and begins reading it. And this is going to be weaved throughout the story, this kind of account of Verity's past, what she's done with her children, and all types of heinous acts that Verity actually has committed. Later, Verity will try to recant this and say that it's not true in a different letter, but it's very detailed, and Lowen does believe that Verity probably committed these acts, and it's kind of left ambiguous for the reader to decide whether or not she did. I personally believe that it probably was Crew, her son, Verity's son, and Verity covering for him, but I have more on that hypothesis later in the video. So beginning in sequence 3, this is the first sequence in Act 2. And this kind of is the fun and games section. It's the promise of the premise. But what I like to say is that it's the promise of the location. You're going to see a lot in a lot of stories, the exploration of the new world. In this case, in Lowen's case, the new world is the house and the property that Verity and Jeremy live on. This is where we start to get some of the fun of whether or not Verity is awake. And there is a missing knife situation that happens at the first pinch point, which is the climax for sequence 3. Throughout much of the story, we get more of the same things that would kind of seem like Verity may be awake, but this is in conjunction with Lowen being a sleepwalker. And I think it can be very easy to overlook the purpose of sleepwalking in this story. The reason I believe that Colleen Hoover used this technique is so that we can still have a reliable narrator in Lowen. Lowen being a sleepwalker means that she won't know what she's doing when she's asleep. However, we can still trust what she sees and does while she's awake. There's not a lot of options to have your character do something and not know what they're doing without undercutting every single thing that they say. Sleepwalking is a way to have confusion about whether or not Lowen is creating these things or if Verity is. Sequence 4 leads us through the midpoint, and it's actually very chilling. During one of her sleepwalking episodes, Lowen awakes in Verity's bed, and this is, I have to say, this is pretty creative, and it definitely was something unexpected in the story. And as a result, this pushes Jeremy into sleeping next to Lowen and cuddling her because she is freaked out by her sleepwalking episode. There is a lot of ways you can bring Lowen and Jeremy together. As I've said in previous videos, the way we see the plot point happening versus what is actually happening at its core, those are 2 different things. What I mean is, at this midpoint, we want something nerve-wracking to happen with Verity, and we want it to cause Jeremy and Lowen to make the next step in their relationship. That does not have to be Lowen sleepwalking and then freaking out. There are endless possibilities of what types of things could have pushed Lowen and Jeremy to that next level of being closer to each other and more comfortable with each other. However, I do believe Colleen Hoover chose in this case something that fit the genre and the promise of the premise very well. So this is what she does at the midpoint. So that leads us through sequence number 5, which of course is going to always start with the fallout of the midpoint. And it does with this story as well. We have conversations about Jeremy potentially locking Lowen in her room when she sleeps, and just having different conversations about how to mitigate the sleepwalking. The climax of sequence 5, though, is the first kiss between Jeremy and Lowen. In most romances, whether it be sweet romance or in this case something a little bit more racier, you're going to have several of the plot points, if not all of the major plot points, be a progression in the relationship. Now, it doesn't always have to be physical touch. It could be something as simple as a deep conversation. It could be holding hands. Honestly, in some stories it is. So in this particular story, at this pinch point, it is their first kiss that is the climax of sequence number 5. It is the climax of sequence number 5. Now, remember that the questions of Act 2 were whether or not Lowen and Jeremy would begin that relationship, and also whether or not Verity was faking it. Well, at the end of sequence 6, we get a very strong clue that Verity might be faking it when Lowen freaks out after several runaround clues that Verity might be faking it. Lowen freaks out and whispers to Verity that she's going to sleep with her husband. And Verity, right after hearing this, still being in her state, she actually uses the bathroom on herself, and we pretty much get a confirmation that Verity is not actually in this frozen state. She is well aware of what's happening around her. In this pinch point where they have their first kiss, Verity is actually watching them, and Lowen sees this. Of course, this makes Lowen freak out. And unfortunately for Lowen, Jeremy doesn't see that Verity was watching them. So they kind of have a back and forth about that as well. But this kind of seals the deal as to whether or not Verity was faking it. And we're going to get more proof on that going forward. But now that Lowen saw that she was standing up, Lowen knows what's happening. So shortly after Lowen tells Verity that it's probably going to go down with her and Jeremy, that's exactly what happens. And the scene is it serves its purpose. They do what grown folks do. I'll just leave it at that. And they do what grown folks do. I'll just leave it at that. And that is the climax. That is the culmination of Act 2. Okay, so in Act 3, we have the story kind of change pace a little bit, and that is exactly what happens in most stories. We have a new question typically presented in Act 3, and I think the question here would be whether or not Lowen can convince Jeremy or prove to Jeremy that Verity is faking it. So in the climax, Lowen does give Jeremy Verity's manuscript. In the manuscript, Verity is confessing to doing a lot of heinous acts towards the children and in the relationship. And it's basically the incriminating evidence that Lowen needs to prove that Verity is capable of faking her illness or her ailment. And as a result, Jeremy goes upstairs. He confronts Verity. Verity does wake up and confirm that she was awake the whole time. And it's at this point that Jeremy kills Verity. That's the climax of the whole story, and in particular the climax of Act 7. In Act 8, after helping Jeremy kind of cover everything up, Lowen and Jeremy begin a new life. They're taking care of Crew, and Lowen has a baby on the way. Lowen does find a letter from Verity trying to recant everything that she said, saying that the manuscript and the confessions were part of a writing exercise. But Lowen decides that she's going to keep that to herself. So that's kind of their new norm and how they're going to live their life going forward, just trying to put Verity behind them. Now, I would say that I think it would be cool if Crew was behind some of the heinous acts or all of the heinous acts that happened in Verity's confession. And it is kind of planted that he's smarter than all the adults and he was always at certain locations, and he knew about his sister's peanut allergy. So there are ways that it could have been him. And since Verity is very much shows favoritism towards Crew, it could be that Verity tried to cover for Crew. I mean, that's just me putting on the writer's hat. But overall, I think that is a fair breakdown of Verity using the 8 sequence story structure. But seeing breakdowns like this is a great start, but not enough. If you want to know the 8 sequence story structure in more depth, I show you how to do that in the video that's on screen now.